Hello. These notes are going over how to add and subtract fractions that have unlike or not common denominators. As a reminder, fractions can only be added or subtracted if they have common or the same denominator. If your two fractions do not have the same denominator, you can find equivalent fractions for both of those fractions that you already have so that they can have common denominators. Then, only once you have the same denominator, you can add or minus the numerators and leave the denominator the same. Make sure you have that written down before we try our first two examples. Our first example says 1/3 plus 1/4. Since this denominator is a 3 and this denominator is a 4, they obviously do not have common or the same denominators. So first, step 1 is we are going to create equivalent fractions. So in our brains, we need to be thinking 3 and 4. What are multiples of 3 and what are multiples of 4 that we can use to get the same common denominator at the bottom of each of these? If you're struggling to think of one that always works is multiplying it by each other. So I'm going to multiply 1/3 by 4 on the top and the bottom because that's my denominator of my other fraction. On 1/4, I'm going to multiply it by 3 on the top and the bottom because that's the denominator of the other fraction. 1 times 4 is 4. 3 times 4 is 12. 1 times 3 is 3. 4 times 3 is 12. So now we have created equivalent fractions for our original fractions, except these two fractions have common denominators. So now if I fill those fractions in to my expression or equation that we are trying to solve, now we have 4/12 plus 3/12, and we can add that. We can simplify that and add those numbers together. 4 plus 3 equals 7, and when we add fractions, we keep the common denominator even on our answer. So our answer is still out of twelfths. So our answer is 7/12 for our final answer on example 1. Let's take a look at example 2. It says 2/3 minus 1/2, which again, those are not the same number on the bottom of our fractions. Those are different denominators. So we can't add or subtract yet. Instead, we are going to come down here and do step 1 by finding some equivalent fractions. So I need to think in my brain, what are some things that 3 and 2 both have as multiples? If I can't come up with anything else, I can always do 3 times 2 and 2 times 3. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to multiply 2/3 by 2 on the top and the bottom, since that's the denominator of the other fraction. Then I'm going to multiply 1/2 by 3 on the top and the bottom, since that's the denominator of the other fraction. 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 2 is 6, 1 times 3 is 3, 2 times 3 is 6. So now they both have a 6 as a denominator, so they have common denominators. If I fill them in right down here where the problem template is, I get 4/6 minus 3/6, and I can actually subtract that. 4 minus 3 would give us 1, and our common denominator stays the same, so our final answer is 1/6. Those are two examples to help get you started. Go ahead and try the next two examples on your own. Before you try and add and subtract, make sure that you find equivalent fractions that have the same denominator on both fractions. Press play on this video when you're ready to check your answer. If you need a hint, part of your first step is figuring out what you're going to multiply each fraction by to come up with these equivalent fractions. These are the numbers that I would multiply by to find common denominators. You could come up with some different ones, especially for the second example. However, this is an easy way to make sure you always find common denominators. Since this fraction says 1/4, I multiplied 2/5 by 4 on the top and the bottom. Since this fraction says 2/5, I multiplied 1/4 by 5 on the top and the bottom. Since this fraction says 1/4, I times this fraction by 4 on the top and the bottom. And since this fraction says 7/8, I multiplied this fraction by 8 on the top and the bottom. Once you do that, you should have equivalent fractions and be able to add or subtract. Push play again when you feel like you're ready to check your answers. Your equivalent fractions should look something like this: 8 over 20 plus 5 over 20, and 28 over 32 minus 8 over 32. Again, there are a couple other ways you could get common denominators, especially for this second example, but this is just the way I chose to get common denominators. As long as you have common denominators and you multiplied the top and the bottom by the same number to get the common denominators, you will still get the correct answer. Our final step is to add or subtract the numerators. So 8 plus 5 equals 13, and our denominator of 20 stays the same. So my answer would be 13/20ths. On the second example, we have 28 minus 8 on our numerators. So that would be 20, and our denominator of 32 stays the same. So our final answer would be 20 over 32. If you used a different way to get common denominators, another example you might, or another answer you might have is 10 over 16 or 5 over 8. Both of those would still be correct. You just used a different way to find common denominators, and so you got a different equivalent fraction. But all of those answers, all three of those answers would be correct. Take a moment to make sure you filled in this entire page.